Order, order. Sir John Whittingdale to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. And it is a pleasure to be serving under your chairmanship today. It's also a pleasure, although not wholly surprising, to see such a well-attended debate, and I think we may struggle to get everybody in. I will do my best to help. And I'd also say I'm delighted to see the Honourable Lady for Barnsley South, the Minister. She and I have spoken together about media matters many times, and it's good to see her back on her former brief, and I understand that the Media Minister is otherwise occupied in the Chamber. It's about a year, just over a year, since I obtained a debate in this place on BBC funding. And of course, since then, quite a lot has happened affecting the BBC. We've had major editorial failings around things like the reporting of the panorama of the President of the United States speech, the coverage of Bob Dylan at Glastonbury, the documentary about Hamas. We've also seen some shocking revelations about harassment and bullying within the BBC, the repercussions still going on of the Hugh Edwards incident, and then the Greg Wallace revelations. And on funding, which I suspect will be the major topic in this debate, last year we saw a further 300,000 people declare that they no longer needed or were willing to pay the licence fee. All of those things, I suspect, have contributed to the decision of Deborah Turness and Tim Davie to resign, and I would like to say that I was sorry that Tim Davie left his post. I think he did a good job in a very difficult circumstance, and it is a sadness that most Director Generals, rather like politicians, have careers that end unhappily. We have also, of course, seen the publication now of the Department's Green Paper on the future, which points out in the beginning that unless the Charter is renewed on by the 31st of December 2027, the BBC will cease to exist. I had responsibility in the main for the renewal of the last Charter, and I didn't want to see the BBC disappear then, and I don't want to see the BBC disappear today. Therefore, it is important that we do actually agree that the Charter renewal document is wide-ranging, it covers a huge amount of ground, and I'm sure honourable members will wish to touch on a number of elements. I'm going to concentrate really on two. The first is the issue of governance and maintenance of standards. The last Charter review resulted in the replacement of the BBC Trust, which at that time had overall oversight of the BBC, by a board bringing together executive and non-executive members. It's worth remembering that the BBC Trust, which preceded the board, was wholly appointed by the government, whereas the board actually only has, well, in theory, 5 appointees by the government, but of those 5, 3 are in agreement with the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly and Northern Ireland Assembly. So the UK government actually only appoints 2 members. So concerns, I think, about political interference and independence are misplaced. The other big change, which was... I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way, but the National Union of Journalists wants an inquiry into allegations of inappropriate interference by current politically appointed board members in the BBC editorial matters. He said that there were only 2. But does he think an inquiry is necessary to restore public trust in the BBC board?
Sir John Whittingdale.
No, I don't. I actually suspect the Honourable Lady is referring to the board member for England, who I believe has an outstanding experience in the field of BBC editorial independence. He spent a brief time in politics, but it is worth remembering that actually the political appointees over many years have come from both sides of the House. The chair or the deputy chair, there was a previous Conservative cabinet minister who was a chair, previous deputy chair who was a Labour cabinet minister. If there was ever a concern, it was actually about the appointment of a management position of a former Labour cabinet minister. That seemed to me much more concerning, since they have direct day-to-day editorial decisions. And at the time, although I got on very well with James Pennell and I worked with him when he was Secretary of State, I didn't think that he should have been appointed to a management position. But I have no concerns about political interference at the moment. I would say that the one thing which I think there is a case for is that the failings which were revealed by the Prescott report about editorial standards, clearly there needs to be some changes to the editorial oversight. And I think, as was debated in the question a few months ago, there is a strong case for making the Editorial Standards Committee much more independent. And I think it is also at least worth considering, and this is part of the Green Paper, whether or not the job of running an organisation of around £5 to £6 billion can be combined with having overall control over the entire editorial output of the BBC. Those are both huge jobs, and I think it is becoming increasingly difficult for one person to hold both of them, and that is something which I think needs to be considered. But the biggest challenge facing the BBC, and it's one which I sought to highlight in the debate a year ago, is about the future funding. We have seen a steady decline in the number of people who are willing to pay the licence fee. The cost of licence fee evasion has doubled so that it is now 12.5%. 12.5%, that's an eighth of people who should be paying the licence fee are not paying it because they are avoiding their responsibility. On top of that, another 3.6 million, we are told, have declared that they don't need to pay it because they don't use the BBC, they don't watch live TV, and therefore they are not required to pay a licence fee. The Public Accounts Committee recently concluded that that results in a loss to the BBC of over £1.1 billion, and it is going to go on increasing. We're seeing more and more choice available through streaming services, which people are choosing to subscribe to. People are no longer turning to the BBC in such numbers for news and current affairs. And of course, the licence fee is rising, and at a time when cost of living is high, people will be considering whether or not they wish to continue to pay for it. So the government is right to look at alternatives, and that is something which I've been involved in for over 10 years when I chaired the Select Committee and we produced a report on the future of the BBC, and I'm delighted to see the current chair with us this afternoon. But a lot of the arguments which we considered 10 years ago stand today. One of the things I was disappointed to see in the Green Paper is, firstly, before considering how to pay for the BBC, in my view, you should ask the question, what do we want the BBC to do? Let us first of all decide what the BBC ought to be doing and then how to pay for it. And yet the Green Paper rules out this debate. It says, we do not believe a smaller BBC is in the public's interest. And therefore, by making that statement, you are not questioning whether or not the BBC still needs to maintain 8 national television channels and 10 national radio stations, despite the fact that the alternative choice available has enormously increased over the last 10 to 15 years.
Should Baker.
My intervention. Well, on that point, we appreciate the importance of the investment by the BBC in the devolved nations and regions, which is all the more important given the fact that private and independent media is withdrawing from some of that coverage and production, and that this year the BBC will double spending to £100 million on programmes produced in Scotland and other devolved nations, and that kind of investment is vital for my constituents and others.
John Whittingdale.
I completely understand that, and the Green Paper actually contains quite a lot about the BBC's involvement in providing coverage in the nations of the United Kingdom and indeed in the languages of the United Kingdom. And if you believe, as I do, that one of the principal purposes of the BBC is to provide content which otherwise would not be available, then this is a good example of where it is absolutely right that the BBC should continue to invest. But I do think that there are some things which the BBC don't necessarily need to continue to do because there is such choice available. And as I say, I regret the fact that that doesn't seem to be part of the debate contained within the Green Paper. It seems to suggest that the BBC should go on doing everything it does now, but that then begs a even harder question, that if the BBC is going to go on spending as much as it does today, how are we going to pay for it at a time when the licence fee or willingness to pay the licence fee is declining year on year? Okay.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I obviously respect his views, having been a former chair of the Select Committee. But does he agree with me that 47 pence a day is value for money for 9 television stations, 17 radio stations, iPlayer, BBC Sounds, BBC World Service? Does he think that that represents good value for money? 47p a day.
Whittingdale.
Whether or not it is value for money is a debate that the BBC have advanced for as long as I've been debating the BBC. The question is, what do you compare it with? Is 25p value for money, or is £1.50 value for money? And unless you decide what it is the BBC is doing, then you cannot determine. And of course, the other big factor behind this is that it isn't a choice. People don't have the opportunity not to pay it. They want the BBC, and indeed live television at all, then they are required by law to pay the licence fee. And so saying, oh, well, it's fantastic value for money is very difficult when nobody's ever really been given the opportunity of demonstrating whether or not they think it's value for money by choosing whether or not to pay for it. I'll give way.
Cameron Chalmers.
One thing I learned recently on the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee was that one way the BBC does provide value for money is it's one of the only sources, if not the only source of income for children's content creators. Without that income, we don't get quality content for our children. So there is a way of looking at this, not from an individual perspective, but an investment in the future. Will you agree with me on that?
I will agree that television is incredibly important, and it is a matter of real concern that fewer and fewer of the commercial channels are investing in children's TV. It was for that reason that at the time of the last Charter Review, we set up something called the Young Audience Content Fund, funded by the licence fee, which allowed other broadcasters to bid to receive licence fee funding to supply children's programming. It was very successful. Unfortunately, it didn't survive the mid-term review, but it was in recognition of how important that is. And I would like to see a revival of the Young Audience Content Fund because I think it was very valuable. The licence fee at the moment, every time the government has looked at it, they've come to the conclusion, well, it has many flaws, but there's no real alternative. The Select Committee that I chaired did recommend an alternative. We looked at the possibility of a household levy. And whilst that isn't perfect, it has also already been ruled out. So that too is excluded by the Green Paper, which states we are not considering replacing it, the licence fee, with alternative forms of public funding. So all of those particular options have been closed off. But the licence fee is highly regressive. It is hard to enforce. It is absolutely right that the evidence shows that particularly women on low incomes face prosecution more than other groups. There are a lot of things wrong with the licence fee. But in terms of the alternatives, the Green Paper does suggest one or two options. It talks about the possibility of extending commercial activity, and that is something which certainly I welcome as contributing quite a large amount already to the BBC's income. But it then goes on to raise the issue. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady Quinn.
Anne Davis.
Thank you very much for giving way. The Again S4C's headquarters is within my constituency of Caerfyrddin, and S4C employs 2,500 people over Wales. It contributes 7.6 million to our economy in Caerfyrddin itself. without the Welsh perspective. Would my honourable friend, although I'm glad to see that consultation is being discussed within the Green Paper, but it needs to be more than a tick-box exercise. So would my honourable friend agree that any consultation has to be a meaningful consultation for the people of Wales and for S4C?
I visited the S4C headquarters and a strong supporter of S4C, which is often overlooked in debates about the licence fee because, of course, it is funded by the licence fee, and that is something that we sought to preserve when I had responsibility for it, and it needs to be taken into account. I was glad to see the Green Paper does actually talk quite a lot about S4C and indeed MG Alba, who supply Gaelic broadcasting in Scotland. But I think the issue which is raised in the Green Paper, which is causing most concern to other organisations, is the possibility of advertising. Advertising on the BBC would obviously change the nature of the BBC, but as is acknowledged, would have a huge impact on all the other commercial broadcasters that rely on advertising. One of the consequences, I suspect, is that Channel 4 would immediately go bankrupt if the BBC took advertising, because Channel 4 is still completely dependent on advertising for its income. And actually, although some people doubt it, I do actually want to see Channel 4 survive as well. But not just Channel 4, ITV depends in large part on advertising, and of course the whole of the commercial radio sector depend on advertising. And if advertising were introduced on either BBC TV or on BBC Radio, the resulting impact on the commercial sector would be enormous, and is not something which I think the government would want to see. And whilst the Green Paper acknowledges there would be an impact, nevertheless it still suggests that this is one of the options under consideration. So that really leaves only one alternative for the future, and that is subscription. It was actually contained in the last charter that the BBC should trial a subscription service on iPlayer for additional content. It never actually happened. The BBC weren't very keen on doing it, but it was there. But I think in the longer term, it becomes a more and more realistic option. Firstly, because the alternatives look less and less attractive or acceptable, but also because in due course it will become technologically possible to do. As I've suggested many times, I think it is not politically or it is not realistic at the present time to talk about the BBC moving to a subscription model. The reason being that there are still a large number of people in this country who rely upon digital terrestrial transmission to receive television services, and if you have DTT, Freeview as it is known, you can't switch it off. And if you can't switch it off, then you can't charge for it because it doesn't allow people to choose not to pay. And so until we move to the situation where everybody receives their television online through the internet rather than through DTT, I don't think it is a realistic option.
I was making an excellent speech and demonstrating why he's such an expert in this area. But I just want to reiterate this point about turning off the free-to-view terrestrial television. This is obviously a live part of this licence fee discussion, and some like ITV are arguing very, very strongly that the terrestrial television should be turned off. But for my constituents, many of them who do not have access to good broadband or connectivity, the idea of being entirely dependent on a fee-paying service is not an option because the connectivity is just not there. Can he reassure me that he understands that those communities would be deprived of a TV service if that option was adopted?
Well, I would say to my old friend that he perfectly illustrates why I don't think it's realistic at the moment. Until we reach the point where everybody in the UK can access TV online, and his constituents, I recognise, it is a bigger challenge for them than for many other parts. But until that time is reached, I don't think it is realistic. But we should begin to prepare for it now, and that is why I think the option that is suggested in the Green Paper is one that we need to consider. Because because the moment, I believe, will come when it does become possible. Now, I realise many other members want to speak, so I'm going to draw my remarks to a conclusion. Just say I welcome this opportunity to debate it. I regret that there hasn't been one before now. And there are a number of possible options, all of which are set out. I would simply say that the one which I don't think is an option any longer is the status quo. And so I look forward to contributions from others about what the future should hold.
Can I remind members to make sure you bob so that we can ascertain who's actually speaking, and we will be imposing a time limit. Sir John was very, very generous with his interventions. We need to keep them much shorter and responses much shorter in order to allow everyone to get in. And on that note, the question is that this House has considered government proposals for renewal of the BBC Charter. John MacDonald.
I'll be brief. I just want to take up the last speaker's main points, really. The issue around the funding is absolutely critical, but it isn't just about the decline in the number of payees of the licence fee. Some of this is inflicted over recent agreements around the funding, and those of us who have been around in the last renewal of the Charter itself and the discussions that were taking place, we need to remind government decisions have inflicted a 30% cut on the BBC. Year after year, we've had decisions which have had below inflation settlements. We then had the imposition of the over 75 licence, and then we had the imposition of the World Service. So a lot of this actually has been government generated in terms of the financial crisis itself. Although I agree there needs to be a longer debate, and I actually do. I preferred the household levy. I thought it was a good idea. I thought the Select Committee did a good piece of work on that, and I regret also the government is not considering that. I can understand the argument will be seen that this will be argued, this is just another level of taxation. Well, that's the same argument that's put anyway with regard to the licence fee itself. The second issue that the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman raised was with regard to the governance itself. The important issue here at the moment is I've heard many members introduce their speeches on a whole range of different issues saying we're living in a politically dangerous moment, and I agree with that. And the danger is we have a politics now where it's very difficult for some politicians to determine it, not just in this country but elsewhere in particular, can't determine between truth and fiction or truth and a lie. And so we need an independent source of information. It certainly doesn't come from social media. Certainly.
Sarah Coombs.
BBC Arabic in Oman in the summer, and they talked about the fact that when cuts to the BBC meant that BBC Arabic radio was turned off in 2023, Russia's Radio Sputnik stepped into that space and started broadcasting false and fake news in the English language. And that is very worrying for all of us, which is why we need an important and successful BBC renewal process which supports the BBC across the world.
Donald.
The point's been made for me very eloquently about that. But it's also about local radio as well, because a lot of our constituents rely upon local radio, and they can't rely upon social media. If you want to see the independence of social media, look at my Twitter account. The abuse levels are unbelievable. And that's just my constituents. Anyway, the issue there is this level of independence, and therefore it does come on to the issue of governance. And I have to say, I've always been opposed to government appointments to the trust or the board, whatever it is. I think it should be done by an independent body. And then the argument will be, well, who appoints the independent body? Well, my view on that, yeah, at least if it is government, the independent body is government appointed, at least it's a bit arm's length. I'd like to see, first of all, on the board, much more worker representation. I'm Secretary of the NUJ Parliamentary Group. We've been arguing for years that there should be at least 25% of worker representation on the board itself, and that others, maybe we should introduce some form of election to some other positions as well. But at the moment, there isn't a view that it is independent. And the argument, well, different governments have appointed different people at different times, I think those individual appointees, and certainly the one that's been referred to in the Select Committee, has interfered in the editorial decisions at different stages with regard to the BBC, and that's unacceptable. So my final point is this, is that if we want independence, we have to have a properly funded body itself. Of course we do, and that funding should be independent of government. We can't go through these decisions time and time again like this. But secondly, there has to be a truly independent board itself. We cannot allow the BBC to be endangered in the future because, as people have said, in this dangerous political moment, we desperately need it. Not just truth in our own country, but as exactly has been said, where truth is being denied to so many other countries across the globe at the moment. This is why we need the BBC.
I will start the front bench winds-ups at 3:28, which means there is a 3-minute time limit on all speeches. Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Caroline Dinenage.
Honourable friend from Malden for securing this debate. I can't think of anyone more qualified to kick off this conversation. The Select Committee will almost certainly be looking closely at the Charter Review, but today I'd like to pull a couple of the topics out for discussion. The BBC's got a number of lofty ambitions set out for it by the government in the Green Paper, but it's clear that this hinges on a Charter Review which finds a long-term sustainable funding future for the BBC. And as we've already seen, there are a number of challenges. The BBC provides so many different TV channels, radio stations, as we've heard from my right honourable friend. It does all of this and more in an incredibly and in more and more challenging commercial environment in which the licence fee is looking increasingly like an anachronism. The extent to which the public no longer see live TV as the cornerstone of their viewing habits is reflected in the number of households not renewing their TV licences. We've heard evasion is rising, now 12.5%. In real terms, the BBC lost over £1 billion of revenue in the decade from 2013. So I was disappointed to read that certain options regarding the size, the scale and the funding are not even on the table in the Charter Review. It says we're not considering replacing the licence fee with alternative forms of funding, such as a new tax on households, etc. I'd be interested to hear why some of these options, some of which are employed across Europe to fund public service media, aren't even being considered by the government. There are obvious challenges around some of the options that are under consideration. You've already heard Mrs Harris about the issue of advertising. The BBC chair told my committee we're absolutely clear that advertising subscription is not the right approach. It goes back to the phrase, he who plays the piper calls the tune. If subscribers are paying, they call the tune. If it's advertising, it's advertisers. So I wonder if the Minister could say more about why they've chosen to explore some funding models and take others off the table at this vital stage. The BBC is the most trusted broadcaster both at home and abroad, but there is no doubt as our national broadcaster we hold the BBC to a higher standard. And there has been a significant loss of confidence to the BBC over recent years. Reuters suggests that between 2018 and 25, the proportion of people who say that the UK trusts the most news most of the time fell 7%, but over that period in the BBC News it fell by 15%. So we do need to welcome the Green Paper's commitment to discuss the provision of trusted news. And finally, the government said that it wants to consider how to uphold the BBC's independence. That includes being transparent when it gets things wrong, how it changes its services, but also how it's governed and what the board looks like. So there are some fundamental questions for this Green Paper to address. What's the government's future vision for the BBC? What role should a public service broadcaster play in this current age? And how we can continue to ensure our national broadcaster remains independent, trusted and valued in this increasingly unstable and divided world.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. I'm honoured to serve under your chairmanship and congratulate my member for Malden for securing this important debate and for his support for broadcasting in minority languages and for making programmes that otherwise would not be made. It was satisfying to see that Gaelic merited 7 mentions in the government's Green Paper on consultation charter renewal. That's about 1 mention for every 10,000 speakers. That's how perilous the language is. But it only represents a tiny fraction of the viewers that Gaelic content attracts on the BBC and elsewhere. The most recent example is in Yelin, a gripping crime thriller filmed on location in Harris. Was the most successful of the BBC's Gaelic programmes, drawing 1.6 million viewers on iPlayer, almost 20% of a record-breaking 8.1 million total views for Gaelic content in the last year. And of course it's not just murder, it's programmes, children's programmes, music, learning for the Gaelic communities and the worldwide diaspora that the BBC and BBC Alapa, the channel co-funded with the BBC, and MG Alapa provides. I'll turn to funding in a second, but I'm glad the Green Paper acknowledges the importance of Scottish Gaelic as a cultural transmitter and a keystone of the language, as it does for Welsh, the Green Paper states partnership between the BBC and S4C has been a cornerstone of the Welsh language media. Similarly, BBC Alba has become the principal broadcaster for Gaelic speakers, except in truth, Ms Harris, there is no similarity, because the UK government generously funds Welsh language broadcasting while giving little or no support to Gaelic broadcasting. This year, the gap in the annual funding for Gaelic and Welsh television will widen to 100 million. Now, admittedly, there are more Welsh speakers, 850,000 and counting, but even proportionally, you have to ask why this remains the case. A previous Conservative government set up the Gaelic Television Fund in 1991 with £9.5 million a year, and nowadays that UK contribution would be £25 million. But funding for MG Alba, the successor organisation, has been frozen for 10 years, and the contribution for from the UK government has fallen to zero. I shall indeed. Thank you.
James Nash.
And I will be as quick as possible. I'm the MP for Rushcliffe in the Midlands, and I'm not sure whether he's aware, but according to Equity, although the Midlands spends 25% or generates 25% of the income from the licence fee, less than 3% is actually spent in that region. So would he agree with me that regional disparities is something that needs to be looked at during this charter renewal process?
Crichton.
Thank my honourable friend for making that point, and I would echo the point my colleague made here about the 100 million being spent in Scotland to make sure that all voices from across all parts of the UK are not just heard and seen in the BBC, but the actual production value and the jobs and the creative content is made in the regions as well. And the BBC does quite well as that. As I said, they contribute £10 million a year. The Scottish Government grants £14.8 million. An extra 1.8 million, perhaps because the Deputy First Minister is a Gaelic speaker. Tap alive Kate for that. But in reality, the budgets for Gaelic broadcasting have been frozen for 10 years, and in the case of Gaelic radio, the real mainstay of Gaelic-speaking communities, budgets have been worse. That means that in 2 years' time, Gaelic broadcasting budgets will be worth just 50% of the launch budget. Now, S4C receives £7.5 million a year from the DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sports, for the transition to digital. Gaelic gets nothing. In Ireland, TG Cahir has €20 million for digital transmission. We have nothing. And I do have hopes, though, because, as I said, this is not a begging bowl. Gaelic creates 320 jobs. For every pound invested, 134 comes back to fragile communities. And I hope that the Cultural Secretary and the Charter Review stay close to the language of the Green Paper, which promised to consider options for providing MG Alba with more certainty over its funding as part of the Charter Review. Now, I don't take a figure, but I would like guarantees from the Charter Review and from the Government that it will give a certainty of support for the Gaelic Broadcasting Service, not just as an incredible cultural asset, but as an economic dynamo, and something that will help us not just keep the language continue and broadcasting continue, but allow us to tell our stories to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Under your chairship. Now, I must know a different BBC from most MPs in this place today, because the BBC is a service that people are forced to pay for, even if they don't use it. It's not fair. And people can even go to prison for not paying the fine. And it's normally the people that do go to prison for not paying the fine are young, single mothers. And the BBC, as we all know, has been riddled with scandal for the past 100 years, but more so in the past few decades. And yes, I agree, the BBC has made some great programmes over the years, great documentaries, environmental programmes, etc. But they've also produced a whole raft of dodgy TV personalities, which probably nobody will mention in this room. Well, I'll tell you what, they do mention it outside in the real world. Personalities such as Jimmy Savile, Hugh Edwards, Chris Denning, Jonathan King, Chris Langham, Stuart Hall, Rolf Harris, Philip Schofield, a whole raft of perverts that have stalked the corridors of the BBC. And none of these here will talk about this. Not one of them. And mark my words, Miss Harris, there are still these creatures stalking the corridors of the BBC, and in the future their names will come out and come back to this. Would you like to intervene? No, I thought not. Look at what they've done.
I'll have no chanting from a sedentary petition, please. Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Miss Harris. Look what they did to Cliff Richard. filmed a raid on his house, an innocent man. Look what they did to Princess Diana. Look what they did to Donald Trump, our closest ally. Bob Villan on the stage shouting, "Death, death to the RDF." And what about the Gaza documentaries? And what about the Honourable Member for Clacton? Dodgy reporting on his bank accounts. The list goes on and on, Miss Harris.
Would he give way?
I will give way on that point, yeah.
Tom Rutland.
He mentions bank accounts. Would he like to declare how much he has received in earnings from another broadcast media channel in the past year in his register of interests?
I'm quite happy to declare that. It's on my register of interests. It's £100,000 a year, and it's probably more than the Honourable Member will ever get paid for appearing on TV. That's if he gets paid anything at all. Anyway, I'm not paying my licence fee. I've not paid it for about 10 years. I'm not paying to subsidise the pensions of people like Hugh Edwards. Now, some people in this room, probably all of them, Miss Harris, may think I'm being a little bit unfair on the BBC. But I'd like anybody in this room, get on your phones right now and provide evidence of another broadcaster that has been riddled with as many scandals as the BBC. People should not be forced to pay for a service that they don't use. Yes, they still make some great programmes, but it should be a subscription service. I will give way.
Can I ask the Speaker if he watches the BBC or listens to the BBC at all? Because he's then obliged to pay his licence fee.
Yeah, I don't listen to the BBC at all. I don't watch live TV. I don't get enough time as a Member of Parliament and as a TV presenter, so all my time seems to be taken up besides. But I'll finish with this. I hope the Minister will agree with me and the vast majority of the British public that people should have a choice. It should be a subscription service, and then people can decide whether or not they watch it and whether or not they pay for it. Thank you, Ms Harris.
Thank you, Ms Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I refer members to my register of interest as someone who has received BBC hospitality and formerly represented BBC workers at a union. I was going to cover the enormous contribution made to the economy by the BBC, but I think other members have covered that. And beyond economic value, there is value to our democracy that comes from the trusted, independent, impartial news provided by our national broadcaster. Of course, the BBC has got it wrong on some stories on occasion, but so too do all media outlets, and the BBC's commitment to getting it right without fear or favour is second to none, and that really matters. One only has to look to the broadcast media landscape in the US to see how difficult it is for people to access news without a slant or an agenda. It's not been good for public discourse or democracy when people can't come to an agreement on the facts of a matter, and I worry that certain broadcast outlets in this country are now blurring the line between news reporting and editorialising. But beyond broadcast media with an agenda, we also have to contend with the increasing amounts of disinformation and misinformation on social media. And it's critical that we have a trusted national public service broadcaster able to get the facts into people's feeds and allow them to come to their own views on the basis of those facts and unbiased, balanced reporting. I will.
Giving way. Does he agree with me that there could well be an ulterior motive of those who question the BBC and who are trying to undermine it, in that the very points that he's making about having a trusted public space is precisely what they don't wish this country and indeed other parts of the world to have going forward?
Without doubt. So it's right that Charter Renewal will seek to deliver a trusted institution that's rooted in independence, accountability and transparency. So when it comes to future funding, I think there are some options being considered that I don't necessarily consider suitable. I think it's right for the BBC to try to generate more commercial revenue, and proposals around growing BBC studios to top up funding have got merit, but we've got to be careful to avoid over-reliance on income generated through some of this activity, such as the selling of international rights for programmes, so that we don't get into a situation where the demands of streaming platforms and foreign markets audiences hold too much weight in BBC content creation decisions. The BBC produces content that reflects British culture, and its current funding model allows it to do so and to tell stories that international streaming giants would not have a financial incentive to tell. I've got concerns around carrying advertising, as I think it will reduce market competitiveness and negatively impact on commercial broadcasters, but also introduce commercial pressures or incentives that could affect editorial and content decisions. I think there are challenges around subscription and paywall models that we've already heard about. And I would be concerned about introducing a subscription paywall for the BBC World Service due to the soft power it projects abroad on our behalf. The BBC is the world's best public service broadcaster, and we're lucky that it's ours, the British Broadcasting Corporation. We'd miss it if it went, and having benefited from it for a century, we have a responsibility to safeguard it for the next 100 years.
The honourable member for Malden for setting the scene incredibly well, and to those who have made contributions so far. I have long spoken of my frustration with the BBC and their role in the new generation of media. Netflix bill paid some years ago was $4.99. It's now $9.99. Sky TV is no longer your one-stop shop, and the BBC certainly isn't with many people either. If you like sports, you pay for the sports package. If you like Housewives, you pay for Hey You. You pay for what is important to you. The difficulty is, if for some unknown reason, this doesn't apply to the BBC. The everyday man who refuses to watch the BBC is tied to pay the bill, and the subscription is more expensive than most streaming prices. It seems simple: if you don't like something, then you don't purchase. But with the BBC, the number of people who don't like it, don't watch it, and who are actually vehemently opposed to their biased reporting on Northern Ireland, on Israel, on trans indoctrination, and a host of other moral values pushed by the BBC. But these people, that's me as well, and my constituents have to foot the bill. In a world of subscribe or unsubscribe, too many people wish to unsubscribe from the BBC.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree with me when he touches on Israel? That only last week we heard that the BBC are now about to fork out £28,000 to an Israeli family that Jeremy Bowen went into their home in the aftermath of October 7th without getting permission to do so, and we're going to have to pick up the bill for that as well.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend and colleague for that intervention. Yes, I read that in the paper and I've seen that the fine that was put on the fellow Bowen in relation to intervention and going into their house without their acknowledgement is completely unacceptable. In the world of subscribe or unsubscribe, too many people unsubscribe from the BBC. For too long, the BBC have had carte blanche in terms of payout to staff with no accountability. The prime example, of course, will be Gary Lineker and the anti-Semitic inclusions in posts that he supported, and the amount of time it took for him to no longer be the highest paid pundit simply would not have happened in the private sector. The latest disgraceful examples of bias reporting as opposed by the internal memo report, which highlighted Palestinian influence and anti-Trump bias, combined with the fact that the management who resigned, they said they urged their staff to continue to do what they've been doing, said there's no restoration of the BBC to the impartial, internationally respected bastion of journalism that it once was. In terms of Northern Ireland, from refusal to train staff to refer to Northern Ireland or to associate the flag of the Republic of Ireland has become the norm, to the outright Republican leniency delivered by programme. There is no salvation in the coverage of politics today and indeed legacy issues. The BBC, which was once upheld as a gold standard, now they can't even refer properly to Her Royal Highness Catherine, the Prince of Wales, whilst reporting on the Remembrance Day services, repeatedly referring to her by her maiden name and a foreign name which she no longer uses, underlines a disregard not simply to our monarchy, but to the principle of trusting the BBC to carry out good reporting, which quite clearly, evidentially, they don't. But what I would say this was the charter renewal is a multifaceted decision to be made. It will take a lot of persuasion from me, and more importantly for my constituents, to believe that the BBC can once again be a trustworthy, impartial service, and this is replicated in constituencies throughout the United Kingdom. It is time for an unsubscribe from the BBC. And whilst I may be tempted, Madam Chair, to continue to subscribe to watch Strictly Come Dancing, which I love, or Call the Midwife, which I also like, I also believe in the principle of getting what you pay for. And I simply don't want to pay for what we are currently getting. I'm finished. 20 seconds.
Holly Billington.
I would just like to ask the honourable gentleman if he actually agrees with the principle that just because he doesn't like something that it shouldn't be produced. Because I think much as we all agree that there are a wide variety of BBC productions that we may not watch, that doesn't mean that we don't think that they should exist.
I think it's very unvalid. I thank you for her intervention. I've not only been following my thrust and talk, I give a number of examples of where the BBC reporting has fallen down drastically in relation to Northern Ireland, particularly in relation to the monarchy. There's programmes, the drama programme, there's many that I like, and I'll give you two examples. But the point I'm making is the BBC, when it comes to impartial reporting and journalism, falls down badly. And for that reason, I believe that the contribution put forward by the honourable member and by others, and perhaps a small number on this side, is one that I agree with.
Members' attention to my register of interest as the chair of the NUJ parliamentary group. Fair funding is a point that many colleagues have made, and it's critical, but ultimately the BBC must remain universal and it must serve everyone. And that means no subscription model, no two-tier system, no paywalls locking people out of so-called premium content. Public service broadcasting only works when it's genuinely public, and that universality must be protected through a funding model that's fair, sufficient and free from political interference. It's clear that sustained cuts and closed-door licence fee freezes have weakened that principle, and that has to end. Now, the BBC, as we've heard, has sustained 14 years of sustained real-term cuts, 30% reduction in its funding. It's lost experienced journalists, hollowed out training and stretched its workforce to breaking point. So it's no surprise that mistakes are more likely when journalists are overburdened and under-resourced, and you can't demand world-class journalism on a shrinking budget. And nowhere are the consequences of cuts more clearer than in regional and local news. Cuts to BBC local radio have stripped many communities of genuinely local programming, particularly affecting older audiences, disabled people, ethnic minority communities who rely most on trusted news. These damaging cuts should be reversed, with renewed investment in live local radio and in digital journalism in news deserts where no other local provision exists. And the same principle of proper funding applies globally. The World Service is one of the UK's greatest assets, reaching hundreds of millions of people across more than 40 languages. It presents us to the world. And in a world where journalists are threatened and independent media silenced, the World Service provides trusted, impartial information. Yet repeated rounds of cuts have reduced its reach and handed ground to state-backed outlets from authoritarian regimes. So long-term, secure funding for the World Service is firmly in the national interest and must be restored. And finally, Salford. The BBC is a powerhouse of creativity and economic growth. Nowhere demonstrates this better than Salford. The BBC's presence here has transformed the city and the wider North West economically and socially, creating skilled jobs, anchoring creative clusters and proving that world-class broadcasting doesn't have to be London-centric, it doesn't have to be the preserve of a wealthy elite. Media City shows what public investment can achieve, so we've got to be clear that weakening the BBC would weaken Salford and the wider creative and media investment that we've seen in recent years in the North West, and that must not be allowed to happen. Thank you.
Mohammed.
Thank you, Ms Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. The BBC is rightly regarded as a national treasure. For over a century, it has been trusted at home and across the world as a benchmark for accurate and impartial journalism. This reputation matters, and it is precisely because of the BBC's global admiration that its recent failures, in particular with respect to its coverage of Gaza, must be confronted. A comprehensive report published in June 2025 by the Centre for Media Monitoring examined over 35,000 articles and broadcast segments over a 12-month period from October 2023. Its findings amount to a devastating indictment of the BBC's claims to impartiality. On a per-fatality basis, Israeli deaths received 33 times more coverage across articles and 19 times more coverage on television and radio. To cite other equally damning statistics, BBC presenters shared Israeli perspectives 11 times more frequently than Palestinian perspectives, and the words massacre or massacred were applied almost 18 times more frequently to Israeli victims. Headlines such as Israel says Rafah crossing to open soon to let Palestinians leave Gaza via Egypt amount to whitewashing of the ethnic cleansing and forced migration inflicted upon the Palestinian people. As the Centre for Media Monitoring report outlines, the term war crimes was mentioned only 3% of articles in relation to Israeli violence against Palestinians. This hierarchy of language dehumanises Palestinian livelihoods, masking grave human rights violations behind a false notion of balance. Internally, over 100 BBC staff and 300 journalists and media professionals wrote a letter complaining that the corporation has become a propaganda platform for Israel, citing examples such as the BBC's shocking refusal to broadcast the documentary Gaza Medics Under Fire. As they write, much of the BBC's coverage in this area is defined by anti-Palestinian racism. This is not balance but distortion. It is not impartiality but systemic bias. Palestinian suffering is treated as less newsworthy, less human, and less deserving of secure scrutiny or outrage. Consequently, serious questions must be asked about the BBC's governance. The continued influence of figures such as Robbie Gibb undermines public confidence in BBC's ability to report without fear or favour. To ensure, the government must ensure an end to partisan appointments and resist politically motivated attacks on reporting. The government should meaningfully engage with trade unions and the National Union of Journalists throughout the charter renewal process. If the BBC is to retain its reputation for courageous, high-quality journalism, it must urgently reckon with its shortcomings, and this government must stop looking the other way.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, and Chair today. I'd also like to thank the Right Honourable Member from Malden for bringing this important issue to this chamber today. Now, in the short time that I've got, I only want to make one real point about the BBC. The BBC is distinctly British. And what do I mean by that? It is a service for all, like the NHS. It is a human organisation. It is not perfect, as we have heard in this room today. And that, dare I say, is a good thing, that we are having a debate in this room about whether the BBC is up to that high standard, because it does have to meet a higher standard than other broadcasters, some of whom pay some of those members in this House a separate salary for that, rather than being full-time. I'm happy to do that.
Very generous with his time. He's quite right. It should be upheld to high standards. Can you think of another broadcaster that's had as many scandals as the BBC over the past 30 or 40 years?
The Honourable Member for Ashfield wants to really hammer the BBC about the amount of scandals. And guess what? It's the biggest broadcaster. So I don't think just talking about numbers is enough. The fact that's really important about the BBC is that unlike other broadcasters, we do hold it to a high standard, and it gets far more scrutiny than any other broadcasters, as it should. Yes, there are bad eggs in the BBC. There are some terrible scandals there too. And ultimately, they should, and usually are, but not always, flushed out. And that is what is in this world of misinformation, where we have far more players out there, where we have fake news out there, where I have constituents in Stevenage say to me, sorry, I don't do mainstream media, but there are people out there who are much more happy to share a fake video out there, which is why it's so important, more important than it's ever been, that we have a national broadcaster that we do hold to account. The question before us now is, how do we make this national broadcaster fit for the age we live in, this dangerous age, where we have misinformation from people who are prepared to take their shilling from private broadcasters out there? How do we have a national broadcaster that meets that standard? And it's a real challenge for this government, and I know it will do its best to review the Charter to make sure we have a national broadcaster that does meet the age that we live in. Yeah. Now, I talked about higher standards in the BBC. And those high standards, we have seen the BBC when it's been called out in this very room today. We have had one member talk about the bias towards Palestine, another member talk about the bias towards Israel. These are right subjective points of view based on facts that they see, and that's fine, and that is good that people have that debate. And so we should in this room. Yes, happy to give way.
Would he agree with me that the facts that I cited were empirical evidence that are irrefutable, and there has been no response from the BBC or the government in response to the report from the Centre for Media Monitoring? Does he agree with me that there should be?
I hear that point. I have not read all that report. I hear what the member has said about that, but the point that I'm making is not about those facts. The point I am making is that it is good that we can have a debate about the national broadcaster in a way we wouldn't for any other broadcaster. And that is so, so important. And I think it helps us listen more, because that's what we need to do more in the age we live in, and through the BBC we can do that. So I would say to all the members in this room and beyond that we must make the BBC fit for the age we live in. If we didn't have the BBC, we would not be in a safe, we would not be in a world that I would want to be part of. So I want to ask the Minister to talk more about how she is going to protect the BBC in the future.
Gregory Campbell.
Chairperson, and I congratulate the member from Malden on securing the debate. Fairness and impartiality should be the hallmark of the BBC, and many years ago it was, but unfortunately in recent years that has not been the case. In Northern Ireland, the BBC understands, and I'm sure others do as well, that, for example, anniversaries of historic incidents in our troubled past are very important if they're done well. People recognise them and acknowledge them and pay tribute to them. If they're done badly, people complain about them. And there are two topical examples I want to use as a reason, just under the Charter renewal, but to try and show the need for the BBC itself to be renewed, because it needs to be seen to be impartially reporting events, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Ukraine, or whether it's in Northern Ireland. Yes, I'll give way.
Very quickly, many of my constituents want to unsubscribe from the BBC. Is it the same in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency?
Yes, I can report it is. People have told me that they no longer purchase a licence because they don't watch live TV, and therefore that shows that there is a lack of confidence in the BBC's ability to report accurately. But I wanted to turn to two very topical examples which demonstrate, unfortunately, what the BBC has turned into in recent days. Just yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the Kingsmills massacre in County Tyrone, where the IRA murdered 10 innocent Protestants, and the BBC Radio Ulster had a programme to acknowledge that, and that was good, right and proper that they should do that. In subsequent hourly radio news bulletins and in that programme, they also told us that the days before that loyalist paramilitaries had murdered Catholics immediately preceding that massacre. Now, it seemed to many that this was an attempt to explain why the IRA took the step that they did to shoot innocent workmen. What was absent from that bulletin, however, and was pointed out by Kenny Donaldson from the victims group SEF, is that the Kingsmills massacre was meticulously planned by the IRA months previously, but the BBC did not report that. But in contrast to that, and in the same month, January each year, the BBC has long-standing coverage of the Bloody Sunday event and close to my constituency in Londonderry. But audiences there are never reminded that immediately preceding the Bloody Sunday incident, 2 policemen were murdered, and there's never any context given about that. And on the very day of Bloody Sunday, there was a Major Robin Nigel Allers-Hankey, the first British Army officer killed during the Troubles. He died from his injuries on that very day. The BBC never mentioned that context, but yesterday did mention a context on what may be regarded and described as the other side of the political equation. I raise these two topical incidents to show that the BBC need to take more care. They need to be meticulous in trying to be seen to be fair and balanced in reporting incidents which are still raw, even though they may have happened many, many years ago. Thank you.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair, and I congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Malden in securing today's debate. Having a new charter is an opportunity for a real reset of the BBC, and I think we've heard many criticisms across the debate today, but having this opportunity does give that fresh start to the BBC, and I think that's really important. But the BBC will only be as good as the accountability systems which are built around this, and therefore it's absolutely crucial that independence is at the heart of that. And I do think detachment from this place and government decisions on who should sit on the board is really an important expression of that. And I certainly do support workers sitting on the board, knowing their own organisation so well. But we need to ensure that voices across and experience from across the nations are also included on a new BBC board. But also we need to ensure that the regulator itself, Ofcom, is also robust in its scrutiny of the BBC. And therefore, I would ask that the Minister also looks at the role that Ofcom can play to enhance the role of the BBC and its accountability and transparency to that. Also, I do want to highlight, in an age where media is driving distrust and disunity, how the BBC re-establishes itself as a trusted media source and brings community cohesion is really important and vital for our democracy and for our country, and trust that there will be a huge emphasis of that within the report. Third, I want to raise the issue of the supply of skills across media, broadcasting, and journalism. We know there's huge opportunity here for the BBC to be that training space for so many of our future skills, whether it is behind the camera or indeed in front of the camera, and therefore would ask the Minister to think about the whole creative sector and the role that the BBC has within that, but also to become an academy for future skills, drawing people from the regions and the nations into being able to provide the future voices and skills for the BBC. Fourth, I want to raise the issue of devolution. The reality is, what we saw the BBC do in removing the local content of radio has seen the listenership fall by 27%. And I really hope that the Minister reverses that and ensures that we don't see this playing on words around neighbourhood radio, which actually means a regional or beyond. We want to see localism. We know that so many people in our community depend on that localism, but also it strengthens the BBC when the voices are about community and it gives the BBC a real purpose. So I trust that that can be centre of the forms. Radical devolution of a centralised BBC would be the regrowth of the BBC.
Thank you, Ms Harris. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. The BBC is one of Britain's finest institutions, and while it has undoubtedly had its problems, as many institutions have, including this place, it does make a significant contribution to our national life. But it must change to ensure that it is fit for the future in a rapidly changing world, and that's why I welcome the opportunity the Green Paper consultation provides. It is an opportunity to ensure issues relating to the BBC's funding, governance and editorial standards are strengthened and its political impartiality is reinforced. It's also an opportunity to consider what the public values about the BBC and what it doesn't. There are some key themes and values which I believe should help shape this process. The BBC must retain its strong regional dimension. Its local radio and TV are important levers to hold decision makers to account. Weakening those functions would lead to poorer decisions in our democratic processes, and individuals and organisations that do not act in a public-spirited way would be given an easier ride. That said, we must be mindful of how coverage of local news on the BBC News' website has contributed to the decline of local newspapers. We cannot have a situation where the local media landscape is monolithic because of the size and scale of the BBC has drowned out all of its competitors. The BBC-funded local democracy reporting service, which employs some reporters at local papers, has gone some way to mitigating this issue, and consideration should be given to whether that should be expanded. Given the rise of AI, fake news and disinformation online and via social media, the BBC must grow its trustworthiness and retain its accuracy and impartiality. It is a linchpin of the UK's creative economy. It commissions and creates world-leading content. To retain and grow this, it needs to be able to invest in programme making at a level which allows it to compete with the streaming services and major US production companies. It must also be able to maintain its globally recognised choirs and orchestras, and the professionals delivering that music making must enjoy good terms and conditions that they ought to have a right to expect. It must build on its educational offer, not just for children and young people, but for adults seeking to retrain and gain new skills in a rapidly changing world of work. But to do all this, it must be properly resourced. The BBC's funding has been cut in real terms by almost a third since 2010, following freezes or below inflation rises in the licence fee and top slicing to fund the World Service and licences for older people. And this has led to losses of highly skilled staff, and it's undermining the Raytheon principles of the BBC to inform, entertain and educate. Whether this will be in part looked at through funding through different models as part of this process, it's important that we consider those different models that may be available to us. So finally, I encourage colleagues, the public and the organisations which care about what the BBC does to engage with the consultation which is open now about the BBC's future. The BBC belongs to us all, and together we can ensure it continues to play an important part in our national life for generations to come.
Anna Sabine.
Harris, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Malden for bringing forward this debate. If you're of an age where your first exposure to television was watching Play School, Danger Mouse and the often overlooked but still culturally significant series Banana Man, you may, like me, have a built-in childhood affection for the BBC. The Liberal Democrats more widely have always been firm supporters of the BBC. We've long championed it as a publicly funded, impartial model of public service broadcasting, and we believe it has a vital and unique place in the UK's media landscape. There's also been a lot of discussion today about unsubscribing from the BBC, and I would also just point out that I would have thought that the NHS and education are examples of two public services which we all contribute to, but which we're able to opt out of by going private, and yet we don't consider that everyone should be able to stop contributing to those because we consider that they're of a wider public benefit, and I would hope that members might recognise the BBC falls into that category. As we look ahead to charter renewal, we want to see sustainable long-term funding settlements that guarantee the BBC's independence and protect it from political interference. This must include an end to political appointments, particularly to the BBC board. Recent attempts by political figures, both at home and abroad, to exert pressure on the BBC only underlines the importance of safeguarding its editorial independence. Allowing political or foreign interference in our media does not bode well for trust in public broadcasting. The BBC is also, as has been mentioned, the backbone of our world-leading creative industries. It delivers outstanding value, economic value, doubling its investment across the creative economy and contributing around £5 billion each year. It produces hugely popular programmes such as The Traitors, while also supporting smaller, more diverse content that may serve niche audiences but is no less valuable. As a huge fan of BBC Six Music, I'd also like to point out that in an age of plastic pop, or at least that's what it all sounds like, stations like Six Music are really key in supporting new, emerging and diverse acts that wouldn't otherwise get national airtime. This is part of the wider role the BBC plays in developing talent. Its apprenticeship schemes allow young people to enter the industry and learn from some of the best in the business before going on to contribute across the wider creative sector. Yeah, sure.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. We've talked a lot about BBC's news output today because we're a room full of politicians. Clearly that's what's going to interest us most. But I'm glad we're now focusing a little bit on the creative output. We are absolutely fantastic. This is a fantastic industry, creative and cultural. It's a major export and it's one of the jewels of this country. Take away the BBC, you smash it. It's part of the ecosystem. This is not just about the news.
Yeah, I couldn't agree enough. And actually, if you speak to other broadcasters, other people involved in the industry, they're just as worried about the future of the BBC for exactly that reason. If you start to pull that plug out of the ecosystem, it causes problems for everybody else. As we sit here today, many of us are agog at what's happening on the international stage. It would be remiss of us not to highlight the importance of the BBC World Service. It provides trusted, high-quality news to audiences around the globe and is a powerful counter to disinformation and authoritarianism. However, its funding has been subject to repeated and unhelpful changes by the previous government, often limiting its ability to plan strategically. The Lib Dems would increase FCDO funding for the World Service, and indeed I'd ask the government to confirm that it's going to sufficiently support the crucial work of the BBC World Service so that it can continue to provide trusted news to a weekly audience of 453 million people worldwide. Much of today's debate has focused on the licence fee, which will be central to discussions around charter renewal. The Lib Dems believe the government must protect the BBC and categorically rule out moving to a subscription model. The BBC itself has acknowledged that subscription funding would undermine universality, public value and long-term sustainability. We believe the government should maintain stable, secure funding through the licence fee until the end of the current charter in 27 and ensure equivalent public funding beyond that point. Charter renewal must deliver long-term financial certainty.
However, we would like to see future decisions on the level of the licence fee being made transparently by an independent body to strengthen the BBC's financial, operational and editorial independence from the government of the day, and consider a permanent charter as part of the renewal process. Has the Minister considered whether this would be a viable option for the BBC? The BBC is one of Britain's greatest sources of soft power, trusted around the world for its independence and accuracy. The BBC helps defend democratic values and Britain's global standing, and it needs our support. Thank you.
Minister Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you very much, Ms Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I refer honourable members to my register of members' interest. And I also congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Malden for securing today's debate on a topic that he is extremely knowledgeable about. And I thank the Minister for being here today. And whilst it's not currently her brief, I know she's also very knowledgeable about this topic. And it's an important one because the future of the BBC is an important matter for its employees, the licence fee payers and people who consume its output in this country and around the world, including many, but a declining number of our constituents. The BBC is a cherished institution and it's the UK's most widely used news outlet. 94% of UK adults use BBC service on average every month. It's informed, educated and entertained generations of Brits. It's one of our most admired and respected institutions and it's one of our biggest global brands. But the BBC faces considerable challenges in the digital age and an increasingly fragmented media landscape, and it has faced other challenges to its reputation recently, some admittedly of its own making. Before Christmas, the government did release its long-awaited Green Paper as part of the process of the review of the Royal Charter. Sadly, it did so in a written ministerial statement rather than on the floor of the House. So today is the first time that we've had the opportunity to discuss this matter properly. The BBC's existence and the licence fee arrangements are contingent on the BBC fulfilling its licence obligations, including on impartiality, and as outlined in the Charter. But recently, there have been too many examples where the BBC has not been following its own editorial guidelines on impartiality, from push notifications to coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict and coverage of trans issues, and of course including the high-profile doctoring of a speech by the President of the United States, which has led to a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. This lawsuit could threaten the future financial stability of the BBC and could lead to resources being diverted away from important and much-loved programming, such as children's TV, natural history series, sport and national events coverage, music, local radio and so on, things that have been mentioned today, and the many things that the BBC does so well that help justify the licence fee and sustain the BBC's brand and reputation around the world. So abiding by impartiality is an important aspect of the current debate because the BBC's own editorial guidelines clearly state that audiences expect the BBC's news and current affairs and factual journalism output to meet the highest levels of impartiality and accuracy. I could not agree more, which is why the accusations of failure to uphold impartiality are so serious. And there is another important aspect of the debate around impartiality. The editorial guidelines also make clear that there is no requirement to give all views equal weight. Minority views, or those less supported by evidence, do not need to be given similar providence or weight to those with more support, to the prevailing consensus, or to those better evidenced. Which begs the question why the BBC cannot bring itself to call Hamas a terrorist organisation and why it felt obliged to reprimand a journalist for saying women instead of pregnant people live on air. Impartiality should not be used as an excuse to push minority or woke views that are not supported by the majority of the British population. Common sense must prevail. This whole area clearly needs a lot of tidying up, and the Charter Review offers an opportunity to do so. So does the Minister agree that the governance structures, processes and procedures around compliance with and enforcement of impartiality and editorial guidelines must be a key focus on the Charter Review process? And does the Minister agree that the BBC should not wait and can of its own volition take action now to change its procedures on overall culture on compliance in advance of the conclusion of the Charter Review process? Now, the Green Paper rightly focuses on the issues of trust, again mentioned many times today, on public good, on driving economic growth and on funding. But as the Honourable Member, the Chair of the Select Committee and others have pointed out, not every option has been considered. But it is right that we should take a thorough review of all future funding options for the BBC, because all options, including the status quo, will have a knock-on impact on other public service broadcasters and on the production and broadcasting ecosystem across the UK as a whole, including, of course, radio as well as TV. But the current licence fee model, in its current form, is clearly not sustainable, in part because people are walking away from the BBC already and taking their money with them, a point raised by the Right Honourable Member for Malden. Since 2019, more than 2 million households have stopped paying the licence fee, and in the past decade, licence fee evasion has doubled. At the same time, the BBC is falling behind innovative rivals among young people. Additional sources of funding for the BBC must be found, without jeopardising the rest of the UK broadcasting landscape and without distorting the rest of the UK advertising market. So does the Minister agree that the Charter renewal discussion also needs to focus on how the BBC can further exploit commercial opportunities, particularly with its back catalogue and revenue from overseas? And does the Minister agree that we must also debate the other side of the equation, the size, scale and scope of the BBC, what exactly its public service content duties should be? Again, a point that seems to be missing from the Green Paper but was raised by the Right Honourable Member for Malden. Now, the consultation also suggests consideration be given to reduced or free licence fee for people on benefits, and that does concern us. It would be outrageous if people claiming benefits were given free TV licences while hard-working people foot the bill. Now, turning briefly to some comments made by other honourable members today. The Right Honourable Member for Malden also expressed his thanks to the outgoing Director General, Tim Davey, and I'd also like to put on record my thanks for his service too. The Honourable Member for Gosport expressed concerns that some funding options had been ruled out already. Again, that's a matter of concern, and I hope the Minister can address that in a moment. The Honourable Member for Ashfield pointed out the concerning reality that licence fee penalties often disproportionately impact women. The Honourable Members for Worthing and the Honourable Members for Salford also pointed out the very important role of the World Service, of course partly funded by FCDO, not entirely by licence fee. And the Honourable Member for Salford also pointed out and highlighted the transformational impact of the BBC's significant investment in Salford, something that I had the pleasure of seeing myself in December. The Honourable Members for Stevenage highlighted the important role of the national broadcaster in the age of misinformation, and the Honourable Member for York Central highlighted accountability and, of course, again, something that we haven't talked about much today, but I'm sure will be a matter of considerable debate going forward, the role of the regulator, Ofcom. In conclusion, Madam Chairman, we want the BBC to succeed. To do so, it must be the best version of itself, and that may be a different version, perhaps quite a significantly different version from what exists today. We look forward to working constructively with the BBC, with the government and all stakeholders in this Charter review process, and I encourage all interested parties, including our constituents, to get involved in the consultation process. And finally, can the Minister commit that she will ensure that there are more opportunities in the future to debate this vital topic of the future of the BBC in government time on the floor of the House and not just via written statements? Thank you.
Minister Steph Peacock.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mrs Harris. And I'm really pleased to respond to this debate on behalf of the Media Minister, who is, of course, in the Chamber on other business. And I would like to congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Malden for securing this important debate. Indeed, as he has said, we have previously debated this and many other media issues many times. And I'm really grateful for him bringing this debate and for the huge expertise he brings to it. And indeed, for all members of all parties across the House for attending. I think today's attendance shows just how important this topic is. I will respond to some of the specific points raised in a moment, but first I would like to begin by saying for over 100 years the BBC has been at the very heart of our national life and our successful media ecosystem. It tells us the story of who we are, our people, our places and the communities that make up life across the UK. Throughout its long history, the BBC has been guided by the Reithian principles of informing, educating
and entertaining. It is one of the most trusted news providers, both at home and abroad, and at a time when the need for trusted news and high-quality programming is so essential to our democratic and cultural life and to our place in the world. A point made by the chair of the all-party group and the member for Worthing, indeed as well as the members for Walsall and West Bromwich. The BBC provides vital educational content for all ages, and of course it's where millions of us turn for high-quality entertainment. The Celebrity Traitors final had over 11 million people tuning in live and sharing that moment together, a point the Liberal Democrats made, I thought, very well. And it's no wonder that the BBC remains the most used media provider in the UK, with an average of 94% of adults using its services each month. The BBC is one of the UK's greatest cultural exports, recognised across the globe and standing strong as the light on the hill, as the Secretary of State would say, a shining beacon in times of darkness and a trusted voice in all the noise. However, I appreciate that our different perspectives held, as this debate has reflected, and I want to address some of the specific points and questions and ideas put to me. And in the interest of time, I perhaps won't be able to go into as much detail, but I can say directly to the Shadow Minister there will be ample opportunity to debate this topic further in this place. Now, the Honourable Gentleman opened the debate by highlighting that the BBC has had a number of challenges, issues and scandals, as indeed members across the House have put. I think, as the Shadow Minister says, some, if not many of them, of their own making, and where the highest standards have not been met, that is unacceptable. As the Secretary of State set out to the House in November, the Chair of the BBC has accepted there have been editorial failings, and this simply is not good enough. Now, this has clearly had an impact on trust, as reflected by the statistics shared by the Chair of the Select Committee. Now, funding is a complex issue, and a number of questions were put to me, and I will address them in as much detail as I can in a moment. But in broad terms, we want to ensure that the cost is as low as possible. We want to examine how efficiently the BBC operates and how it provides services and the way they are delivered, whether that should be revisited. Now, the Chair of the committee put a number of quite big questions to me: the long-term sustainability in terms of funding settlement, the changing viewer habits, and indeed the scope and size of the BBC. I think we're going to debate all of these, not just over the 16-week consultation, but indeed over the coming year as we debate Charter. And if I've got time, I'll come back in a little bit more detail. I thought the member for Salford spoke really powerfully, giving a number of examples really important to her own constituency, and I was pleased to visit when I was the Media Minister. And I just want to put on record that I have heard the points around minority language and indeed the issues raised by colleagues in Northern Ireland, and indeed last December, the December before last, I should say, now we're in January, obviously the Honourable Gentleman held a debate in the main chamber. I'd just like to address this point very specifically put to me by the Shadow Minister on concessions. We are not looking to expand free TV licences or give them free to those in support of benefits. Indeed, an example from Germany was taken out of context from the Green Paper, so I can be very clear about that now. But I'd like to go into a little bit more detail in terms of the BBC has clearly reached a critical juncture. The market has changed significantly, and this Charter review is a timely opportunity to set the BBC up for success in a new and dynamic world. Indeed, since the last Charter review 10 years ago, in which the Honourable Gentleman had responsibility for, and he said in his debate in December 2024 that the changes that have taken place in the 10 years in the broadening landscape, and I quote, since then have been huge and continue to accelerate. The new Charter will formally set the terms of the BBC for the future, with a clear ambition to set it on a path to thrive well into the latter half of this century. Our Green Paper, published on the 16th of December, represents the first step on this path as we set out our vision for future-proofing our national broadcaster. Now, the 4 sections outlined in the paper include governance and trust, funding, mission and purpose, and technology and digital. The BBC must remain independent, genuinely accountable to the public it serves, and critically, it must continue to command public trust. Further afield, the BBC must also continue the World Service's vital work in providing trusted and truthful news internationally, and indeed, members have given a number of examples. It's absolutely vital that the BBC is trusted by the British public and commands confidence in its impartiality as our national broadcaster. The Charter Review will support this aim and provide an opportunity to ensure the BBC remains trusted, independent source of news for UK citizens that it has been for over 100 years. As the current Media Minister has said, the corporation's future should not be tainted by the problems of today. Charter Review will also ensure that the BBC remains an engine of growth, driving good jobs, skills and creativity across the UK. As part of this, we are considering how the BBC can further support the production sector across the nations and regions, including by ensuring that budgets and decision-making powers for commissioners are spread across the UK, a point the member for York made well. And we are considering how the BBC can deliver more through others, working collaboratively and in partnership with organisations across the creative economy and the local news sector, something I've heard from my own local paper, and indeed the member for Mid Derbyshire made a very important point on this. But the BBC role extends beyond economic growth and innovation. Whether it's to celebrate the coronation of His Majesty King Charles or to cheer on Britain's gold medal wins at the Paris Olympics and Paralympics, the BBC has the power to bring the nation together. People right across our nation must be able to access content that genuinely reflects their lives, their communities and their contributions, so that all of us can see ourselves reflected in our national story, a point I think the member for Stevenage spoke about. This means the BBC must commission, produce and distribute stories that are truly rooted in diverse UK experiences and promote British stories and creativity to the world. And I've seen this in my own area, whether the BBC's long read last week on the history and regeneration of our brilliant town centre, thanks to our Labour Council, or the Who to Watch in the Yorkshire music scene, just a couple of pieces of coverage that the BBC have done from my own area. Now, we know to achieve all of this, the BBC must also be funded in a way that is fair and sustainable for the long term. The Right Honourable Member for Malden secured a debate on this topic in December 2024, where he highlighted challenges with the licence fee, noting, as we do in our Green Paper, that the landscape has hugely changed since he was responsible for drawing up the current charter. He spoke during that debate about some of the alternatives to the licence fee, which also have their challenges, and he rightly identified the need to be considered alongside broader decisions about the future of television too. And indeed, it was in this chamber, in my last debate as Media Minister, that I responded to a debate on the future of television, which is incredibly relevant to the topic that we are talking about. Our thinking is certainly accounting for these points. And at this stage, we are keeping an open mind on this issue, and the Green Paper sets out a range of options we are exploring, including how the BBC can operate more efficiently, how it could generate more commercial revenue, and how the licence fee could be reformed. This is a complex topic, and the public consultation will provide an opportunity for the public to have their say. In the interest of time, I'm really sorry I cannot respond in detail to some of the points. I had made notes to do so, but I will make sure that myself or the Media Minister writes in answer to some of the specific questions raised. We know that some funding options would represent a significant shift for both the sector and the BBC, as well as for audience experiences. Now, the Right Honourable Member for Malden has previously raised concerns about the potential for advertising on the BBC to impact commercial providers. A thriving media sector involving ITV and Channel 4, our diverse local media providers and others is vital for the UK, and I wish to reassure him that we are carefully consider the potential impacts on this ecosystem. I've heard the points he's made today, and of course we debated them at length during the passage of the Media Bill, now Act. We are also considering options for funding of the World Service, of which I know the Right Honourable Member and indeed members across the House who have given hugely brilliant examples today is a great supporter, and the funding for minority language broadcasting, including S4C. Indeed, I was pleased to visit last year when I was the Media Minister to see their work firsthand, so that the rich linguistic heritage of our communities can continue to thrive and to grow. Now, there are many hard questions that we raised through this charter process, but it is important that it is the start of the conversation. There will be many more debates in this place and indeed in the main chamber as we have this discussion. The intention of the Green Paper is to spark a debate, is to get members from across the House and indeed people up and down the country to share their views and their thoughts, and we will continue to engage with the public and with Parliament, which of course have the chance to have a full debate. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank all members for their contributions. And I'm just about to sit down, but I will give way.
Thank you. Green Paper is about the future of the BBC, but we also have to address the issues and challenges that it faces today while the consultation goes on and the new charter is defined, established and implemented. So please, would she advise when or the government and the BBC respond to the report from the Centre for Media Monitoring with substantive sort of action points as to how it's going to prevent or improve going forward?
For the honourable gentleman, as I've said at the opening of my remarks, we expect the BBC to maintain the absolute highest editorial standards, and where it has fallen short, we have urged them to take action. I'll take that point away and I'll reflect it to the Media Minister. I would like to thank so many members for attending this debate. I think it reflects how important this issue is and indeed how important the future of our national broadcaster is. Thank you, Chair.
Sir John Whittingdale to briefly wind up.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. Can I thank you, the Minister, and all those members who participated in this afternoon's debate. The fact that there are so many present, and to my regret, I suspect a lot of members have had to curtail their remarks due to the time limit, I think demonstrates the importance of this subject, and I welcome the Minister's assurance that there will be further opportunities. My right friend is right, it's important that as many people as possible respond to the consultation, although I suspect that the Minister and her officials may hope that we don't have a repeat of what happened last time, which was a 38 degrees campaign generating 190,000 responses. DCMS had to hire a new building in order to count them all and read them all. But it is important, and I hope that this debate is just the start of what will continue to be a discussion leading to the next charter. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered government proposals for renewal of the BBC Charter. As many of their opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. Can colleagues quickly leave and quietly for the next debate, please? Thank you. Minute, guys.